into something already dead, the Amadral, an ore hauler of 11 decks that had stopped moving under its own power 90 years ago and had been turning a slow ellipse around a burned world ever since. The Marrow Concorde bought the wreck for the price of the metal in it. Then it bought the system's registry entry, the transit lane that passed within 4 hours of the hull, and the silence of 2 governments whose charts still showed the region as empty. 61 years of contract work, 11,406 subjects through the intake arch. The number the Concorde actually cared about hung on a plate above that arch, where every arrival could see it on the way in. 9 hours, 40 minutes, mean time to yield. Most arrivals read it twice, and the ones who read it a third time were the ones who came in under an hour, because by then the plate had stopped being a statistic and started being a promise. 31 species had passed under it. 4 of those species no longer existed for reasons the Concorde's filing did not address and no client had ever asked about. Third chair interrogator Doal had worked the arch for 19 of the 61 years. She had a routine. She read the acquisition summary in the receiving bay while the subject was still sedated, because a subject's face told you nothing before it woke and everything after, and she preferred to have the paperwork out of the way by then. The summary was 4 pages. She got as far as page 2 before she stopped. The acquisition itself had been ordinary. A salvage tender, human flagged, designation Bellwether, running a recovery contract on a collapsed relay platform in unclaimed space. Crew of 9. 2 boarding teams went aboard through the aft lock during a shift change and met no resistance worth recording. They took one. That was policy, not restraint. A full crew registered as a fleet action, and a fleet action drew attention the Concorde's clients paid specifically to avoid. So the standing order was to take the cheapest one. The manifest made that easy. 8 of the 9 were logged to active stations. Pilot, 2 engineers, a medic, 4 on the recovery deck. The 9th was logged to nothing at all. Off rotation. Sleep cycle. Rack 4. They cut him out of the rack webbing while he was still under, and the boarding officer's note said the subject did not wake during extraction, transit, or intake processing, which was itself unremarkable. The sedative used on humans was rated for 4 times a human's mass. Page 2 was where it stopped being unremarkable. Doal read the biometric strip. Then she read it again, holding her thumb under the line the way she did when a number had been entered by hand instead of pulled from the sensor. Capture stage cardiac response, -11%. Every species Doal had ever put in a chair spiked at capture. It was not courage or the absence of it. It was chemistry. A body that has been grabbed floods itself, and the flood shows up on the strip as a spike, and the spike is the first honest thing a subject ever gives you. 31 species, 11,406 strips. She had personally never seen a negative. The sensor had recorded him going down. Slower heart, lower pressure, respiration lengthening. The profile of something settling, not something caught. Sensor fault, said Ledger Chair Emuth without looking up from his own reader. Emuth handled valuation. He priced arrivals the way a scrapper prices hull plate, by mass and by category. And he had already priced this one. Recalibrate the intake pad and re-log him. I'm not carrying an anomaly on a subject worth this little. He was asleep when they took him. He was worth nothing when they took him. That's why they took him. Emuth flicked the reader off. Non-combatant, no rank, no specialist rating on any registry we can reach. The other 8 had stations. This one had a bed. Dwal did not argue. Emeth was almost always right about value, and being right about value was the only kind of right the Concorde paid for. She went down to observation anyway. Cell 9 was 4 meters by 3, lit from above, with a floor that drained. The human was sitting on the bench along the far wall. He had been awake for 11 minutes by then, which meant he had already done what everyone did in the first 11 minutes. Found the door seam, found the drain, found the camera. Every subject found the camera. Most of them then spent an hour pretending they had not. He looked directly into it and lifted one hand briefly, the way you would to someone across a corridor. Then he lay down on the bench, put his forearm over his eyes, and went back to sleep. Dwal stood in observation for 6 minutes, watching a man sleep in a Concorde cell on the strength of nothing but a folded arm. And she found that she had not moved, and that the 2 junior monitors behind her had stopped narrating the feed the way they were required to, and that no one in the room wanted to be the one to say the obvious thing out loud, which was that the plate above the arch gave a mean of 9 hours and 40 minutes, and this one had not yet asked a single question. She pulled his file up on the observation screen and read page 2 for the 3rd time. Sergeant Owen Dietrich, 34 standard years, recovery crewman, no rating, no rank of consequence, no reason to exist on any list the Concorde kept. They had woken him at 4 o'clock station time. Of every decision made at Site Hold 9 that year, that was the one that ended it. Cell 9's light did not change with station time. It ran at one setting, day and night, because the Concorde had learned early that a subject who could not track hours stopped trusting his own count of them. The order came down on Dwal's slate at 6:20, unsigned, which meant Emeth had entered it from the valuation desk rather than the floor. Protocol 1. 2 hours, then reprice and move him to the general hold. 2 hours was not an interrogation. 2 hours was a formality performed on cargo. Protocol 1 was the soft ladder. No pressure, no deprivation, no chemistry. A chair, a table, water, and an interrogator who behaves for a while like a person. It worked more often than anything further up the ladder, which was the part clients never believed. Of 11,406 subjects, 73% had yielded on Protocol 1 alone. Another 21% broke on 2. The last 6% were the reason the Concorde kept a medical wing. Dwal had run Protocol 1 900 times. She had a shape for it. You gave the subject the small dignity of being asked before you took the larger one of being told. She brought 2 cups of water in and set one down in front of him. Sergeant Owen Dietrich, she said. Recovery crewman, Bellwether, that's right. Do you know where you are? No. Do you want to know? He considered the water. He did not drink it. Not really. The 2 monitors behind the glass were logging, which meant every pause was time-stamped, which meant Dole could feel the log filling with her own silence. She moved on. She asked him what the Bellwether had been contracted to recover. He told her. Relay platform collapsed in on itself 11 months earlier. 800 tons of recoverable alloy and 1 intact reactor housing that the salvage lien priced higher than the rest of the hull combined. He gave her the lean number. He gave her the underwriter. He gave her the crew split on the contract and the percentage the underwriter held back against damage. Dual had been prepared for refusal, and then for lies, and then for the elaborate half-truths that clever subjects mistake for resistance. She was not prepared for a man reciting an invoice. She checked two of the figures against the Concorde's own intercept file. Both matched. That was the problem. Everything he said was true, and none of it was worth anything. A lean number was not a fleet position. A cargo split was not a rendezvous. He answered fully, and the fuller the answers got, the emptier the log looked. At 7:40, she changed the shape. "Your crew left," she said. 8 of them. They cleared the platform 4 hours after you were taken, and they did not broadcast, they did not hail, they did not file a distress. They ran. Okay, you understand what that means. Yeah, say it. He looked up. It means they left. There was no crack in it. Dual had spent 19 years listening for the exact place where a voice thins out, and his did not thin. It sat where it had been sitting since 6:20, flat as the bench he'd slept on. So she went to the last thing on the list, the one that worked on nearly every species that kept rank. 8 of them had stations, she said. You had a bed. Nobody sent a team for the man who was asleep. He nodded slowly, like she'd said something reasonable. Then he asked a question. Was it 6? What? The boarding team. Was it 6? Behind the glass, the junior monitor stopped logging. Dual heard it stop. It had been 6. One of them stopped in the galley, Dietrich said. Second man through. Checked the lockers, then came aft. Took him about 40 seconds. The boarding officer's report ran 9 lines. Dual had read it that morning. Line 4 recorded a 40-second delay at the galley bulkhead, attributed to a stuck hatch. She kept her face still. She had trained for years to keep her face still, and it had never once cost her as much as it cost her in that chair. You were sedated, she said. I was asleep. Those are the same thing. No. Emmett came down to the floor at 8:05 with the intake tray, because Emmett did not believe in anomalies and preferred to bury them under evidence of worthlessness. He set the tray on the table. It held everything the human had arrived with: a cut coverall sleeve, a tension strap, and a flat metal disc the size of a thumbnail. Valuation, Emmett said. Fabric, strap, junk. The disc was a mag tag. Dual knew what it was because the Concorde's own boarding teams carried the same idea in a worse form. In a dead hull, you cannot trust a light or a marking or your own memory of which passage you already walked. So a salvage crew slaps a tag on the frame of every compartment they clear, and the tag holds a magnetic charge. And the next man through pings the passage and hears which spaces have already been swept. It is how 9 people take apart 800 tons without walking the same corridor twice and without leaving anyone behind in a compartment nobody logged. Emmett priced it at 0, and he was right. By mass. Dual turned it over. The face was worn smooth, the edge rounded, the keying surface scarred by recuts, a tag rekeyed to a new hull and then another, more times than she could count in the scoring. A crewman with no rating and no rank had swept more dead ships than the number on his file allowed for. Junk, Emmett said again, and took the tray. Dietrich folded the cut sleeve into a square before they took it, which was a thing Dole had no category for. He set it on the tray himself. He did not argue about the disc. "Thank you for the water," he said. Then, at the door, "What time is it?" Duval told him. 8:41. He said thank you a second time, and went and lay down, and was asleep in under 2 minutes. The junior monitor flagged it in the day log as cooperative behavior, subject compliant, no measures required. She also noted, because the field required a count, that it was the 4th time he had asked the hour since intake. She did not note the intervals. That entry was reclassified 11 days later, by which point there was almost no one left at Site-Hole 9 qualified to reclassify anything. The Concorde priced a subject the way it priced salvage, which is to say by what could be got for it and what it cost to keep, and the two figures went in adjacent columns on Emeth's ledger so that the difference between them could be read at a glance. Dietrich's first column read 0.6. Nothing at Site-Hole 9 had ever read below 1.0. A standard unit was one adult of a mid-mass species with a marketable skill and no medical liabilities, and everything the Concorde had ever processed sat somewhere between 1 and 14 of those, except the man in cell 9, who came in at 6/10 because he had no rating, no rank, no clearance, no political value, and as of 9:15, no raring, no crew willing to come and argue about him. The second column read 0.4 and rose 0.04 a day for feeding. 11 days, Emeth said. Then he costs more than he sells for. That's not an opinion, third chair. That's the sheet. Duval had come to the valuation desk with the day log open on her slate, and the entry she had come about was the count 4 requests for the hour in the first 13 hours, and she had already decided on the walk down not to mention the intervals, because she did not have a category for the intervals either, and Emeth ate uncategorized things for sport. I want to hold him past 11 days. On what basis? On the capture strip. The capture strip is a sensor fault. I recalibrated the pad. It reads clean. Emeth turned the ledger around so she could see it, which was the closest he came to argument. Then it's a sick human, a cold human, a human with a bad heart. You are asking me to carry an 11-day hold on a 6/10 subject because his pulse went the wrong way while he was unconscious. He tapped the crew column. Look at what we didn't take. Pilot, rated. 2 engineers, both rated. A medic with a trauma certificate that prices at 4 on its own. Any one of them is worth the whole hold. We took the one who was asleep because the one who was asleep was free. That was correct then, and it's correct now. It was correct. That was the trouble with Emeth. He had been at the desk for 31 years, and in that time the sheet had been wrong perhaps 6 times. and every one of the 6 was a story people still told, which was how Dole knew the number. She went to the archive instead. The Concorde kept 2 archives. The open one held acquisition histories, species profiles, yield curves, client correspondence, the working memory of a business that survived by knowing what a body was worth before it arrived. The sealed one held 409 documents, and a third chair could open a sealed document only by logging a reason that a prime chair would later read. Dole logged anomalous capture stage cardiac response, human, single subject acquisition. 3 documents came back. 2 were medical and useless. The third was a handling advisory, 11 years old, drafted by a second chair whose name had been struck from the header and left as a blank the width of a name. She read it standing up, which she regretted. The advisory did not say humans were dangerous. It said something worse. In the flat register of a document written by someone trying very hard to sound like a document, it said that human social attachment did not correlate with rank, contract, kinship, or duration of association, and that, consequently, the Concorde's entire valuation model, which assumed that a subject's retrieval risk could be estimated from that subject's institutional worth, did not function on them. It said that in every recorded instance, retrieval effort scaled not to the value of the human taken, but to the closeness of the human taken, and that the 2 figures were unrelated, and that no reliable method had been found for measuring the second from the outside. It said that of 11 Concorde operations that had removed a single human from a bonded human crew, 3 had ended in write-off. Dole read the sentence 4 times. Write-off did not mean a lost subject. Write-off was a ledger word. It meant the operation itself had ceased to exist as a line item. The recommendation ran to 1 line and had been circled by hand at some point by someone with access to the physical copy. Take the entire crew or take none. She brought it to Emoth and watched him read half a page. 11 years old, he said, unsigned. Struck, not unsigned. Struck is worse. Somebody's name came off this, and I can guess whose, and I can guess why. He pushed it back. Do you know how many advisories the sealed archive holds about how frightening some little species is? Underwriters write these. Competitors write these. A crew that loses 3 hulls in a year writes one of these, so the loss reads as doctrine instead of incompetence. 3 of 11. Ledger chair. 3 of 11 what? It doesn't name a site. Emoth stopped. He had reached the appendix line at the same moment she had, the previous evening, at the desk in her quarters, with the light off everywhere else on deck 6. The advisory did name a site, once in the citation column, with no accompanying narrative, because the narrative had been a separate document, and the separate document was not in the archive at all. Sitehold 4. Dole had joined the Concorde 2 years after Sitehold 4 stopped filing. She knew the name the way everyone knew it, as a gap in the numbering, an installation that had gone quiet during a client dispute, its contracts reassigned, its staff listed as reassigned also, though nobody had ever met one. 14 years, Emoth said. It went dark in a client dispute. That's what we say? That's what the file says. The file is 1 line long. Emoth closed the ledger. He was not a coward, and he was not stupid, and Dole saw him arrive at the same place she had, and saw him decline to stand there. 11 days, he said. Then he's repriced and moved. Put it in the log. She put it in the log. That night she requested the Sighthold 4 narrative through the open archive, since it was not in the sealed one, and the request came back inside 90 seconds, faster than any archive returns anything. The document existed. It ran to 1,600 pages, which was not a report, it was a feed. And it was flagged at a clearance 3 levels above her own, held not by the Concord at all, but by a client office she had never heard of, in an admiralty she had no business knowing, had been watching Sighthold 9 for 9 years. The buyers came on the 11th day, which was not a coincidence, because Emuth had scheduled the walkthrough for the day the sheet turned, 3 of them. A Yedden factor named Hess Olin, who bought physiological stock for testing houses, and 2 silent partners whose credentials the front desk logged as observers, unaffiliated, a phrase the Concord used when a client did not wish to be a client on paper. They came aboard through the dorsal lock at 11 o'clock in soft dress with no insignia, and Galtesek met them personally, which he had not done for a buyer in 4 years. Sentry Prime Galtesek ran security at Sighthold 9 and held opinions about interrogation that he expressed by not expressing them. He had been a boarding officer for 2 decades before the Concord bought his contract, and he did not believe that a species could be understood from a chair. He believed a body told you what it was when you made it work. Cell 9, he said. The tender crewman. Put him in the bay, Duval said. He's under a hold. He's under a hold for 11 days. It's day 11. Galtesek did not look at her. You want him kept, keeping costs. This is how we pay for it. The bay was the Amadral's old number 2 ore transfer hall, 90 meters end to end, and the Concord used it for the thing every buyer eventually asked for, which was proof that the stock functioned. You could show a factor, a medical strip, and a rating, and he would nod and offer you 60%. You put the same subject in the bay and let him work, and the number moved. Galtesek had built the scenario himself over 2 shifts, which Doyle learned later from the requisition log, and which told her more about him than anything he said that day. They had a wreck section on the deck already, 18 meters of a collapsed passenger frame, brought in years ago for training and never cut up. He had it lit badly on purpose. He had the atmosphere dropped to a human breathable minimum, and the deck temperature run down to just above the point where fingers stop being useful. 2 compartments in the frame were sealed behind a jammed hatch. Inside one, weighted to 200 kilos, was a dummy mass in a pressure suit. The task was posted in 3 languages. Enter, clear, locate, recover. 90 minutes. He's rated for nothing, Hess Olin said, reading the intake summary on the walk down. Why are we watching this one? Because his file is short, Galtesek said, and short files lie. They brought Dietrich out at 11:40. He'd been given a work coverall 2 sizes wrong and a hand light with a partially depleted cell. Doyle checked the cell afterward and found the depletion logged as maintenance, which it was not. He stood at the mouth of the wreck frame with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at a hill he's been told to walk up. 90 minutes, Galtesek said. Recover the mass. Okay. He went in, What followed was, by every measure the Concorde used, a poor performance. He took 11 minutes on the first 8 meters. He stopped at the frame junction and put his hand flat on a stanchion for the better part of a minute, doing nothing. He tried the jammed hatch twice with the wrong approach, pulling, then levering from the low side, and gave it up. He went the long way around through a service crawl that added 20 meters. Twice he backed out of a passage he had already entered and took it a second time, which is the single clearest sign of a man who has lost his place in a dark hull. At 61 minutes he found the compartment. At 74 he got the mass out of it, badly, dragging it on the deck instead of walking it up onto his back, which cost him time and would have cost a real casualty a spine. He came out at 88 minutes and stood breathing in the cold with his hands on his knees. Hess Olin had stopped watching at 40.6, Emmeth said to nobody with enormous satisfaction. The two unaffiliated observers had not spoken during the entire 90 minutes. The taller one wrote something down. Doel, standing 4 meters behind them, could not see the slate and would spend a considerable amount of time later wishing she had moved. Galtesek said nothing at all. He watched the human breathe, and Doel watched Galtesek and understood, from the way his jaw sat, that he had seen the same thing she had and did not yet know what it was. She got it that night, alone, running the bay feed back at quarter speed. The minute at the stanchion, he had his hand flat on the frame, and the frame carried, and he was not resting. He was feeling the hull answer him, where the mass was, where the voids were, which side of the junction was load-bearing. She counted the pauses after that, 9. Every one of them at a structural node, every one of them under a minute, and every one followed by a decision that turned out to be right about the shape of a wreck he had never been inside. The 2 passages he re-entered were the 2 passages that connected. He had not lost his place. He had confirmed a loop. The jammed hatch he'd failed on twice was welded, not jammed. She pulled Galtesek's requisition and found the weld, and it could not be opened by any method available to a man with bare hands, and Dietrich had spent under 90 seconds on it before finding the crawl. 88 minutes on a 90-minute clock. Not 82, not 70, 88 with a 2-minute margin on a task he could have finished by Doel's count of the route he'd already mapped somewhere just past the hour. She sat with that for a while in a dark office on deck 6. He had been asked to perform badly enough to be worth nothing, and he had done it with a precision that required knowing exactly what the room considered failure. At 2:10, the deck watch chime went once, and she went up to the monitor floor because she was not sleeping anyway. Outer picket 4 was off the board. Debris strike, the watch officer logged and did not send anyone, because pickets ran a 14% annual loss rate in a system full of the same rock that had killed the Amadral. At 3:55, picket 7 went off the board. The watch officer logged debris a second time. Doel stood behind him and looked at the schematic for a long moment, at 2 dark points on a ring of 11, and did not say the thing that had occurred to her, because the thing that had occurred to her was that the 2 dark points were not adjacent. They were opposite, exactly opposite, which is not how rock arrives. The valuation board did not come to site hold 9. Nothing above a prime chair had set foot on the Amadral in 9 years. They convened by relay at 9 o'clock on day 12. 5 chairs in 5 stations across 4 systems rendered on the wall of the conference deck at slightly different scales, because no two of the feeds agreed on how large a person was. First chair Odrum opened with the sheet, because the sheet was the only document a board ever opened with. Subject 9. Human. Single acquisition. No rating. Carried at 6/10 against a keeping cost that crossed it yesterday. He did not look up. Ledger chair. You've a buyer standing. Hess alone, Emeth said. Physiological stock. He'll take him at 4/10 on the understanding that the material is consumed. Doal had prepared 11 minutes. She got 4. She gave them the capture strip and the recalibration record. She gave them the advisory. 11 years old. Its author's name struck out to a blank the width of a name, and read the recommendation line aloud, because she wanted 5 chairs in 4 systems to have heard it in a human audible register. Take the entire crew or take none. She gave them 3 of 11 and the word write-off, and she watched the number land on exactly one of the 5 faces. Advisories are not doctrine, Odrum said. This one cites a site, so do 100 others. It cites site hold 4. The relay had a lag about a second and a half, and the pause that followed was longer than that. Doal had spent 19 years learning to read a pause. This one was not surprise. It was 5 people separately deciding not to be the first to speak. Site hold 4 went dark in a client dispute, Odrum said. Then the narrative file will say so. I requested it. It exists. It runs to 1,600 pages, and it is held at a clearance 3 levels above mine by a client office that isn't in our directory. She let that sit. I'd like the board to open it. That's my entire request. Not the hold, the file, the 4th chair. A woman whose feed rendered her smaller than everyone else said, 3rd chair? Do you know what you're asking for? I know I can't get it myself. No. The 4th chair said, you're asking us to put a request in writing. That was the moment Doal understood she had already lost, and had lost some days ago, and had come to the conference deck to find out only how the loss would be phrased. The vote ran 4-1. The dissent was the 4th chair, who abstained rather than opposed, which is what abstention is for. Subject 9 to Hessolan at 4/10, Odrum said. Transfer on his outbound day 14. 3rd chair Doal is thanked for her diligence. The wall went dark in 5 staggered pieces. They moved Dietrich to the general hold that afternoon to clear cell 9 for an incoming, and the route from the cell block to the hold ran along the deck 8 gallery, past 11 barred compartments that held the stock nobody was working on. Doal walked it because she was the officer of record until day 14, and the log required an officer of record. Gal Tessek walked it because Gal Tessek had begun walking things. Dietrich went between them without restraint, which was standard for a subject rated below 1, and he looked into each compartment as he passed it, in no hurry, the way a man reads door plates in an unfamiliar building. At compartment 11, someone stood up. He was Yedin, old for it, the plating around his throat gone gray and soft. He had been in the hold for 6 years, and his file listed him as unsold stock, which, at Site-Hold 9, meant a subject the Concorde had acquired and then found it could not legally move. Sethuvar. Doal had walked past him, perhaps 400 times. He came to the bars and looked at the human, and then at Doal. "That's a human," he said. "Sit down, Sethuvar. You have a human on this station." Galtesic stopped walking. Dietrich stopped because Galtesic had. "I said sit down. How many did you take?" Sethuvar's hands were on the bars. "Third chair." "How many? Off the same hull, how many did you take?" Doal should have kept moving. She had a subject in transit and a sentry prime at her shoulder and a board vote in the log, and the correct action was 6 more steps down the gallery. "One," she said. The old Yedin closed his eyes. "I was a ledger clerk," he said. 31 years at a valuation desk. "Do you want to know which one?" Galtesic said. Four. Sethuvar's voice did not change. "I priced them. 2 humans off a survey hull, and we took one because taking one didn't register as a fleet action, and I wrote the sheet that said the other 7 weren't worth the exposure. 6/10. That's what I carried him at. 6/10, and I was correct, because he had no rating and no rank and nothing on him worth the mass." Site-Hold 4 went dark in a client dispute, Doal said, and heard how it sounded coming out of her own mouth. Site-Hold 4 went dark section by section. He was looking at her now with something she did not have a word for, from the outside in. 11 hours, and I want you to understand that at hour 6 we still had power and full atmosphere and 140 staff, and nobody had been hurt, and every single person on that station was already. Galtesic moved him off the bars with one hand, and the gallery door came down, and whatever the end of that sentence was, Doal did not hear it that day. She heard it 11 days later. By then it did not need saying. Doal requisitioned the Site-Hold 4 narrative a second time on day 13 through the open archive, using the same wording, because she had nothing left to try, and the request cost nothing. It came back in 90 seconds again. But the return was different. The first time, the system had given her a stub, 1,600 pages, clearance 3 above her own, held by a client office with no directory entry. The second time, it gave her that, and then appended below it the thing an archive does when a document has been read too many times by the wrong person. An access log, not hers. The documents, 1,600 pages, held for 14 years and opened 4,011 times. Doal scrolled. The requests were not distributed the way requests are distributed when people are curious. They came in dense clusters, 60 and 80 at a stretch, and every cluster sat inside a window of 9 or 10 days, and the windows repeated on an interval she recognized before she could name it. She put the clusters against the Concorde's own acquisition calendar, and the interval named itself. Every time Site-Hold 9 took a subject, somebody read Site-Hold 4, not the Concorde. The requesting office carried a routing prefix she had never seen on a client file, and when she ran the prefix against the open registry, it resolved to an Admiralty Communications relay, and the relay resolved to a fleet, and the fleet was on deck. Dowell sat in a dark office on deck 6. For some time, the on-deck did not buy stock. They had no testing houses, no labor market, no interest in physiological material. They were a fleet power with 1,100 hulls, and a doctrine so old it had stopped being doctrine and become simply how things were done, which was that the on-deck did not take prisoners because the on-deck had never needed to. You did not capture a species you could outmass. You presented at their orbit, and they yielded, and yielding was a transaction, and the transaction was the entire war. Then, the on-deck had met a species that did not yield, and had spent 9 years quietly not talking about it. She pulled the acquisition calendar back up and made herself read it as a document rather than a schedule. 61 years of contract work. 11,406 subjects, and for 52 of those years, the Concorde had taken what its buyers ordered. Species by demand, bulk where bulk sold. 9 years ago the pattern changed, single acquisitions, one subject at a time, off crews of 6 and 9 and 12. From unclaimed space, always the cheapest one aboard, always the one whose absence would not register as a fleet action. Dowell counted them, 31 across 9 years, and she had personally logged 11 and had never once looked at the shape of the column because a third chair reads rows. 26 of the 31 were human, and every one had been priced under 1. Every one had been the crewman with no rating, the cook, the hand, the man asleep in rack 4. The Concorde had not been selling stock to an admiralty. There was nothing an admiralty wanted to buy. The Concorde had been running an experiment for 9 years and billing it as brokerage. And the question the experiment asked was not what a human was worth. It was whether a human could be taken quietly, whether a crew that lost its cheapest member would come, how far, how fast, what it cost the taker. Because if the answer was no, if the cheap ones could be removed one at a time without a response the fleet had to notice, then the on-deck had a method, not for one man, for a species. You do not need to fight a population you can disassemble by the piece at the edges in unclaimed space forever. 31 trials, 26 subjects, 9 years, and 3 write-offs, one of which had a name and a numbering gap, and an old Yedden clerk in compartment 11 who had priced the wrong man at 6/10. Dowell went down to the hold at 23:40 on day 13, with none of this authorized and no reason logged. Dietrich was sitting against the wall with his eyes shut. He opened them when she came in. "You were taken because you were the cheapest man aboard," she said. "Yeah, your crew knew that would be the rule." He didn't answer. "Sergeant, your capture strip went the wrong direction. A body that is grabbed floods. Yours settled." She heard her own voice doing something she had not permitted it to do. "You went down slower than a man falling asleep on his own." "I was asleep on my own," he said, "for a while. 6 of them came aboard. You were in rack 4 with the webbing across you, And the second man stopped in the galley for 40 seconds, and you knew it. She stopped. How long were you awake before they cut you out? He looked at the floor between his knees for a moment. Then he pushed his left sleeve up to the elbow. There was a scar on the inside of his forearm, 4 centimeters, healed, pale and flat and old. A year old, maybe 2, well past anything the boarding could have done. And under it, faintly, a hard line the width of a matchstick. You scanned me twice, he said. Intake and the bay. Dual had read both scans. Both were clean. The Concorde's arch could find a filament transmitter in a molar. It doesn't transmit, Dietrich said. It's a magnet. Same as the tag. It just sits there, which meant it could not be found by anything looking for a signal, and did not need to be, because a magnetic mass in a known place on a known body does not have to say anything to be read by a hull that knows how to listen, and a salvage crew that takes apart dead ships in the dark for a living is nothing but 9 people who know how to listen to a hull. 4 hours, Dole said. They cleared the platform 4 hours after we took you, and they did not broadcast, and they did not hail. They ran. They didn't run. Then what were they doing? Sweeping. He pulled the sleeve down, same as always. You tag what you've cleared so nobody walks it twice. Above them, 3 decks up, outer picket 9 went off the board, and the watch officer logged debris. And by then there were 4 dark points on a ring of 11, and no 2 of them were adjacent. Legate Sunmar Ove arrived at 6 o'clock on day 14 aboard a courier with no markings, and the front desk logged him, at his own instruction, as observer, unaffiliated, the same phrase it had used for the taller of the 2 silent buyers 3 days earlier, which was not a coincidence, because it was the same man. He came on to the conference deck without escort and put a slate on the table and said, "The Edine Factors transfer is cancelled. Subject 9 is retained under fleet authority. Ledger chair, you'll invoice the difference." Emmeth looked at Doal. Doal looked at nothing. "Third chair," Ove said. "You requisitioned a document twice." "Yes. Do you want to see it?" That was the thing about OHV. He did not threaten, and did not need to. And Doal understood within 30 seconds of meeting him that he was not a client, and had never been one, and that the Marrow Concorde had spent 9 years as a department of something else without ever being told. "The Concorde's arrangement ends today," he said, "not as a penalty. It ends because the trial is complete, and complete trials are closed. What remains is a single measurement, and I would prefer to take it here, because the equipment exists here, and because you have a subject in hand who has not yielded in 13 days, which is itself the measurement's most interesting feature." "You want a limit," Galtesic said. "I want a number." Ove turned the slate around. "The doctrine question is whether a population can be reduced at the margins without producing a fleet response. The commercial answer is 31 trials, and it is favorable. And it is not sufficient, because 31 tells me what happens when we take the cheapest one, and it does not tell me what a single one costs to hold. If holding is expensive, the method fails at scale regardless of response. So, endurance envelope, thermal, pressure, and duration, standard protocol, run to the point of physiological failure, with a medical recovery attempt afterward in good faith. He said the last three words without emphasis, which somehow made them worse. The chamber they used was on deck 4 and had been built for a species that no longer existed. It could take atmosphere down and temperature down and pressure through a range that nothing in the general hold would survive. And it had a window because the Concorde had built it in a decade when clients liked to watch. They brought Dietrich up at 8:20. He asked what time it was. Dole told him 8:22 and he said thank you, and that was the 14th time by the day log's count and the first time anyone had written down the interval, because Dole had started writing them down on day 12. The intervals were not regular. That was the thing she had not been able to categorize. They clustered. 4 requests inside a single hour, then nothing for 11 hours, then 3 more. A man tracking time asks at intervals. A man asks in clusters when he is checking a drift, when he already knows the hour and is measuring how far the station's clock has moved against a count he is keeping in his own head. You would need to do that if you had left with a rendezvous window and no way to carry a clock. OHV ran the chamber himself. It took 4 hours. Dole watched through the window for the first hour, and then from the observation feed, because the window was worse. Thermal down in stages. Pressure in stages. The medical strip on the wall was the only thing in the room that reacted at all in the first 90 minutes, and it did what the capture strip had done. It settled, respiration lengthening, the whole body dropping into a lower gear like something being packed away for storage. At hour 2 he stopped answering. At hour 3 the strip started to break up and the recovery team was called to the door, and Ove held them at the door with one hand for 11 minutes. They got him out at 12:40. He lived. His core temperature took 4 hours to come back, and his left hand did not close properly again for a week, and he did not speak until the following morning. OHV read the strip in the corridor while the medical team worked behind him. 26% above projection, he said, and wrote it down, and that was the entire content of his reaction. Dole found the flaw at 15 o'clock in the projection itself, which Ove had left open on the conference table because it did not occur to him that anyone at Sighthold 9 could read it. The Ondrak model was elegant, and it was 9 years old, and it was built on 31 trials. And every one of the 31 had been a single subject, isolated, held alone, with no other member of their crew aboard. That was the whole design. That was what made it clean. It also meant the model had never once measured a human who was not alone, and had therefore quietly assumed, across 9 years and 4,011 readings of a document about a station that went dark section by section, that the number it wanted was a property of a person. The advisory in the sealed archive had said the opposite in a single line 11 years earlier, and someone had circled it by hand, and someone else had struck that person's name off the header. Retrieval effort scales to closeness, not to value. OHV had spent 4 hours measuring how much a man could take. The measurement he needed was how much 8 people would. Dole took the projection down to the hold at 16:30 to say some version of this to a man who could not yet talk, and she did not get there, because at 16:34 the gallery door on deck 8 sealed on emergency lock, and the corridor lights went to standby, and Gall Tessek's voice came over the deck channel flat and unhurried. Pickets 3, 5, 8, and 10 were off the board. That made 8 of 11, and Gall Tessek had stopped logging them as debris sometime on day 13 and had put a boarding team of 6 into a hopper at 14 o'clock to go and physically look at Picket 4, and the hopper had cleared the dorsal lock at 14:11 and had not answered since 14:19. Dewal was still holding the projection when the second announcement came. Compartment 11, Deck 8, Sethu Var, unsold stock, 31 years a ledger clerk at a valuation desk. He had been moved out of the gallery on Ove's order that morning as a security measure since he had spoken to a subject in transit. He had not survived the move. The log recorded it as a restraint incident during relocation, which was true in the way the sheet was always true, and Dewal read the entry twice and thought about a man who had priced the wrong human at 6/10 and had spent 6 years in a barred compartment waiting to tell somebody, and had got 11 seconds of it out. She never did learn the end of his sentence. Prime Chair Kasuth came aboard on day 15 at 4 o'clock, which was the middle of no shift, and had the general hold cleared and a chair brought up to the conference deck, rather than use an interrogation room, because Kasuth did not use interrogation rooms. He had processed 940 subjects in 38 years, and had never gone past Protocol 2. That was the number the Concorde put in front of clients, and it was accurate. And Dewal had spent 19 years trying to work out whether it meant he was the best interrogator alive or simply the one most careful about which subjects he accepted. He read the file for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Third chair, you've logged 14 requests for the hour." 15, he asked again at 3:50. "And you've been recording the gaps?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because they cluster." Kasuth turned a page. "Give me the projection Leggett OHV left on this table." She gave it to him. He read that too, and when he was done, he set both documents down squared to the table edge and said, "The Leggett has spent 4 hours establishing that this man's body is 26% stronger than a curve. The curve was built from 31 men who were alone. He does not appear to have noticed that this is a different question, and I am not going to be the person who tells him." Prime Chair. "I am going to break the man instead," Kasuth said, "because that resolves both questions at once, and because it is the only remaining action that produces a document I can sign." They brought Dietrich in at 5:15. He was walking badly. His left hand sat curled at his side, and his face had the flat gray look of someone 4 days behind on sleep, and he sat down in the chair Kasuth had brought up without being told to. Kasuth did not start with a question. He started with an inventory, which was his method, and Dewal had seen it work on a Farron magistrate in under 2 hours. "You are 34 years old," Kasuth said. "You hold no rating. You hold no rank above the minimum your registry issues to a body on a manifest. You have no clearance, no specialization, no certification of any kind, and no entry in any professional register in 9 systems. You were taken because you were the cheapest object aboard your own ship, and that assessment was made in under 90 seconds by a boarding officer who has never been wrong about it. Your crew has not hailed has not broadcast, has not filed, has not negotiated, and has not appeared. It has been 15 days. Every subject who has sat where you are sitting has believed something about themselves that the room disagreed with. That is the entire content of this work. I find the belief and I show the person the room 940 times. So I want you to tell me what you think you are, Sergeant, because I have read every page of you and there is nothing here. It was a good speech. Doal had heard him do versions of it, and it had a rhythm to it that got inside people, and it went on for another 90 seconds, and it was rehearsed to the syllable, and standing at the back of the conference deck, she understood, with a kind of slow horror, that Kasuth had written it on the courier, on the way here, about a man he had never met, and had therefore been afraid of him for 2 days. Dietrich let it finish. "I sweep hulls," he said. "That is not an answer. It's the answer." Kasuth's jaw moved. "Show him the archive," which was the mistake, and Doal saw it and said nothing, because she had spent 15 days trying to get someone to open that file. They put Sighthold 4 on the conference wall. Not the 1,600 pages, the feed. Ove's clearance had come aboard with OHV, and Kasuth had signed for it at 4:30, and what came up was 14 years old, and ran in the corner of the wall at real speed. An installation schematic. 140 staff. 11 hours of a station going dark section by section, from the outside in. Doal had expected something violent. That was not what it was. The outer sensor ring went first, 1 point at a time, not adjacent, the same shape she had been watching on her own board for 4 days, then external lighting, then the docking control. Then, at hour 4, the archive lock and the emergency channels, which is to say the ability to ask anyone for anything. At no point in the first 6 hours did anybody at Sighthold 4 get hurt. That was the part that made it unbearable. 140 people with full power and full atmosphere, standing in their own station, watching the map of themselves get smaller from the edge in, one compartment at a time, methodically, at a pace that never varied. Somebody had tagged what they'd cleared, so nobody walked it twice. At hour 9, the feed showed the corridor outside the valuation office, and a Yedden clerk in the door of it with his hands empty, and the feed cut there, because that was where the recording ended. And Doal now knew the answer to a question she had asked a man in a barred compartment on day 12. Nothing had happened to Sethuvar at Sighthold 4. He had been let go. He had walked out of an 11-hour silence and spent 6 years in a cell trying to tell somebody what the inside of it felt like. The wall went dark. Kasuth said, 14 years ago, a different station, a different crew, a different decade. Whatever you are counting on, Sergeant, it is not coming for you. Nobody sends 8 people across 9 systems for a man rated at 6/10. Dietrich lifted his head. "You've had me 15 days, he said. "How many hulls do you think that is?" "I beg your pardon? You asked what I think I am." His voice had not risen at all. "I sweep hulls. 15 days is about 11. Galtesek was already moving toward the door. Then the conference deck lights dipped once, came back, and dipped again, and did not come back, and the emergency channel opened on its own and put a soft chime through the whole station, which was the sound Sighthold 9 made when its outer sensor ring reported 0. And in the standby glow, Dowall looked at the man in the chair and saw him do the only thing he had done in 15 days that resembled an expression. He checked the clock on the wall. "Seal the deck," Kasuth said. Galtesek did not move to seal anything, because Galtesek had been a boarding officer for 2 decades and had understood the sound of that chime before it finished. And the first thing a boarding officer learns is that a sealed deck is not a defense, it is a list. Sighthold 9 held 406 compartments across 11 decks, 181 staff, 22 pressure locks, of which 4 were rated for hard docking and 18 were maintenance ports the original ore hauler had used for hull crews, and which the Concorde had welded shut 61 years ago, because welded ports do not need watching. Welded is not sealed. A salvage crew knows the difference better than anyone alive, because welded is what they get paid to open. External lighting went at 5:41. Dowall was on the monitor floor by then. The board showed the outer ring at 0 and the docking control amber and everything else green, and the watch officer was reading the green off to Kasuth in a voice that got steadily more insistent as the greens went out, one at a time, unhurried, in an order that made no tactical sense at all until you saw it laid over a schematic. They were not taking the important things. They were taking the outermost thing, then the next outermost thing. Docking control at 5:52. The dorsal lock array at 6:4, which meant the Courier O had come in on, was now a shape attached to a hull rather than away off it. The long-range channels at 6:9. The archive lock at 6:11. At 6:11, the Marrow Concorde lost the ability to ask anyone in 9 systems for anything, and nobody at Sighthold 9 had yet been hurt. That was the part Dowall had not been able to imagine from the feed. 14 years ago she had watched 140 people stand in a station with full power and full atmosphere and watch themselves get smaller, and she had thought, when she watched it, that they must have been slow, that they must have missed something. They had missed nothing. There was nothing to miss. Every system that went dark was a system you could live without for another hour, and by the time you could not, the hour was gone. Deck 12 reports a compartment they didn't sweep, the watch officer said. Aft frame port. It's on the board as swept, and the team says they never went in. Then the board is wrong, Kasuth said. The board isn't wrong, Galtesek said. He brought it up on the wall himself. The compartment showed a maintenance flag, entered at 5:47, logged clean, closed. Beside it, 7 more, all aft, all port, all entered in sequence, all marked in the station's own maintenance register by a technician ident that had not been aboard in 4 years. They're tagging, Galtesek said. Emeth said, tagging what? Us. He put 2 fingers on the schematic and drew a line down the port side without touching the wall. They're using our register. Every compartment they clear, they mark clean in our own system so they never walk it twice, and so anything we send behind them reads the space as already handled and goes somewhere else. They're not hiding from the station. They're using the station to keep count. That's a maintenance register, Emma said. It's for scheduling. It's for knowing where you've been. That's all a register has ever been for. Dual was thinking about a hand flat on a stanchion for 1 minute in a cold bay. He had walked 18 meters of collapsed passenger frame and known where its voids were by touch. 9 pauses, 9 structural nodes, and a loop confirmed by entering the same passage twice on purpose. The performance had been terrible by every measure the Concorde used, and every measure the Concorde used had been designed by people who had never once had to take apart something dead in the dark and come back out of it. 8 people had been doing that to the Amadral for 15 days. Not from the outside. That was the last thing to arrive. And it arrived at 6:20 when Gal Tesek pulled the atmosphere log rather than the security log, because atmosphere does not lie and cannot be written to by a maintenance ident. Deck 2 aft, a 2% pressure differential, standing since day 9. They had come aboard on day 9, 6 days inside 406 compartments, in a wreck that had been a wreck before the Concorde bought it, sweeping it the way you sweep anything dead, slowly and completely, and in an order, while 181 people ran their shifts overhead and priced a man at 6/10. The pickets had not been reconnaissance. The pickets were the last thing you take, once you already own the inside, so that nothing gets a message out and nothing gets to be surprised by having been surprised. Doal turned around. Kasuth had not spoken in 4 minutes. Prime Chair Kasuth, 940 subjects, 38 years, never passed Protocol 2, was standing with one hand on the edge of the conference table, looking at a wall that had been showing his own station going dark, section by section, for 39 minutes, and his face was doing the specific thing Doal had spent 19 years learning to look for in other people. OHV came onto the monitor floor at 6:26 with his slate and asked, in the same voice he had used to hold a recovery team at a chamber door for 11 minutes, how many were coming. 8, Doal said. 8 is not a fleet response. No. Then this is not a response, Ove said. This is 8 individuals acting outside any doctrine, for a man of no value, at a cost that cannot be justified by any model of. That was the finding, Doal said. 11 years ago. Somebody wrote it down, and you struck their name off it. Dietrich was still in the chair. Nobody had moved him. There had been no reason to move him, and then, very quickly, no one whose job it was, and he sat with his ruined left hand in his lap and watched the wall with the rest of them, and had said nothing since 5:15. At 6:31, the internal channels went, deck by deck, from 11 downward. At 6:33, the lights on the conference deck came up to full, which no one had ordered, and which Doal understood immediately was not a mistake and not mercy, but simply the last small thing being taken, the ability to be in the dark. Dietrich stood up. He did it slowly, favoring the leg, and he looked at OHV, and then at Kasuth, and then at Doal, and he spoke for the first time in an hour and 15 minutes. I wasn't the one you needed to worry about, he said. The Deck 8 gallery door released at 6:34. They all heard it, 3 decks down, through 406 compartments of dead ore hauler, because it was the only sound left on the station. Nobody at Site Hole 9 was killed on day 15. That was in the record afterward, and it was accurate. And it was the single fact that nobody who read the record ever believed on the first pass. The 8 came up through Deck 8 and took the Amadral the way they had spent 6 days learning it, compartment by compartment, tagging what they cleared. They carried cutting gear and hull tools, and 2 of them carried nothing at all. They did not announce themselves. They did not make demands, because a demand is a negotiation, and a negotiation assumes the other side has something you have not already taken. 181 staff went into the general hold in groups of 12 over 4 hours. The medical wing was left running. The atmosphere was left running. Doyle walked in with the 4th group and was not touched, and stood for a long time against a wall she had walked past 400 times, looking at compartment 11, which was empty. They found Dietrich on the conference deck at 7:10, sitting where he had been sitting. She saw the reunion from the gallery at a distance of about 30 meters, and she had built something in her head over 15 days about what it would look like, and it looked like almost nothing. The chief came in first, a woman a head shorter than him, and she put her hand flat on the side of his face for perhaps 2 seconds and said something Doyle could not hear. He said something back. Somebody else took his left hand and turned it over and swore. Then they got a blanket around him, and one of them said clearly in the flat human way, "You want to sleep in here or on the ship?" Ship. That was the whole of it. He did not go and look at Kasuth, who was in the second hold with the valuation staff. He did not ask for OHV, whose courier was still welded to a dead dorsal array. He did not say anything to Doyle, who was standing 30 meters away, in a gallery he had walked down twice, and who had spent 15 days building a case that no one would open, and who found, when the moment came and went, that she had not expected to be thanked, and was not. He asked one of his crew what time it was. They told him. He nodded and worked out something behind his eyes, and said he was 4 hours off, which the man beside him seemed to find funny. Then he went aft with the blanket and slept for 19 hours, and Bellwether undocked at 9:40 with all 9 aboard, and Site Hold 9's dorsal array came back on 11 minutes after they were gone, along with the long-range channels, and the archive lock, and the lights. The Marrow Concorde filed a distress at 9:58. In the weeks that followed, the accounting happened the way accounting always happens, slowly and in rooms. The Concorde's brokerage license was suspended in 3 systems and surrendered in a 4th. Hess Allen's testing house canceled 6 standing contracts inside a month, not on principle but on exposure, since a factor who buys single acquisitions from unclaimed space is a factor whose name appears in a 1,600-page narrative that 4 separate registries now held copies of. The sealed archive was opened by a tribunal that had no jurisdiction over the Concorde and did not need any, because by then the Concorde existed mainly as a hull in a slow ellipse around a burned world. The Andrak Admiralty did not authorize the harvest program. There was no announcement, because there had never been an announcement of the thing it was canceling. There was a doctrine review, and the review ran 9 months, and the finding was published as an amendment to evaluation standard that fleets and brokerages across 9 systems had used for 200 years, a line inserted into the section on retrieval risk, stating that for certain species, the cost of taking one member could not be estimated from that member's value, and that where such estimation was not possible, acquisition was to be treated as an action against the whole. In practice, it meant one thing, and everyone who priced bodies for a living understood it within a week. Humans stopped being takeable. Not because they were feared, because they could not be costed, and an industry that cannot cost a thing does not touch it. 31 trials over 9 years, 26 humans. The last one was worth 6/10 of a standard unit, and he ended a market. Ove was reassigned to a survey command and wrote nothing further. Kesuth resigned his chair before the tribunal reached him and was not heard from. Galtesek testified for 11 days, at length, without being asked twice. Of the interrogation staff at Site Hold 9, one was still in post when the tribunal closed. Her file was amended once, in the flat register of a personnel system that has no field for anything else. Do all. Third chair. Retained pending review. Reassigned archive. She spent the rest of her service reading the documents nobody had opened, and at the top of every one she wrote the same 4 words in the margin, by hand. Somebody wrote this down.